Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our fifth in our series of virtual events that we are hosting through this year to celebrate the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission's 25th anniversary. This is our 25th year of being in existence. And our hope is that through these events, you will get to know more about us, the Friends, and our mission to support the Texas Historical Commission in its preservation efforts across the state. And hopefully that you will choose to support us as you participate in these events. I wanted to welcome and thank everybody else that is on with us today. Our board members, Rowena Dash, I see is on, and I think maybe Laretha Clay is planning on getting on as well. Former board members, Virginia Nicholas and Lee White, thank you both for joining us. I believe we have Commissioners Gravel and McKnight who will be joining us or who may already be on. Thank you as well. And then colleagues from the Texas Historical Commission, Brad Engel, Charles Sadnick, Bill Irwin, Sarah McCleskey. We have some friends as well, Jean Crane from the Texas Historical Foundation. And I am not sure if Leslie Midgley is on yet, but she's planning to be on. Leslie Midgley is the president and CEO of the Texas Land Title Association, which is a partner to the Texas Historical Commission and the Friends of the THC on our courthouse stewardship program, and we so appreciate their support. Before I introduce our team at the Friends, and before we get started, I wanted to let you know that we have another virtual event planned for Saturday, June 12th at 2 p.m. This is going to be a foodways and food history discussion and a demonstration of a historical recipe from Ida Eisenhower's kitchen at the Eisenhower Birthplace State Historic Site in Denison, north of Dallas. We hope you'll be able to join us for this event. And registration is open at www.thcfriends.org. A few housekeeping items. We would appreciate it if you could keep your microphones on mute and your cameras on. We'd love to see your faces. But while our speaker is presenting, I would recommend that you switch your viewing option to speaker view so you can see Joe Holley properly. You can hear him speak. And then once we are done, I'll remind you all to come back into gallery view so that we can all see each other, have a conversation, ask questions, however you'd like to participate. We'll start with the presentation, and we have planned time for question and answers, conversations, sharing of your stories if you have some. I'm sure Joe would love to hear those as well. If you'd like to do that, you can do it one of two ways. You can raise your hand, use the raise hand feature in Zoom, or you can drop your name in the chat box and Katie or I will call on you and you can ask your question, or you can type in your question in the chat box and we can ask for you, whatever works for you. I want to now introduce the Friends team before we introduce our speaker for tonight. Hope Baran is our social media expert who has been reaching out to you via Facebook at THC Friends and on Instagram and Twitter at friends_THC. If you are on social media, please do follow us on these platforms. We'd love to have you join us. Hope shares some incredible, fun information on these platforms with our audience every day. And for those of you who'd like to share this event with your friends, we are on Facebook Live right now. So please feel free to go to our Friends of the THC Facebook page, pull the link, share that with your friends who are interested in this event. Reina Andrade is the invisible force behind the scenes at the Friends. She keeps us all going and makes sure that Katie and I do what we need to be doing every day. And then last but not the least, my colleague, my partner in crime in fundraising work that we do, and the brains behind these events, Katie Kukerbaum. All yours, Katie.
Thanks, Anjali, and welcome everybody. Thank you, Joe, for joining us. I also want to give a shout out to my dad, Glenn Smith, who's with us tonight and who introduced us to Joe. So we're appreciative of you as well for helping Joe get to us. So I'm going to introduce Joe and share a little bit about his background. Joe Holley has been the native Texan columnist for the Houston Chronicle since 2013. A native Texan himself from Waco, he's been an editorial page editor in San Diego, California, a contributor to Texas Monthly, a speechwriter for Governor Ann Richards, a staff writer for the Washington Post, and an editorial writer for the Chronicle from 2012 to 2017. He was a 2017 Pulitzer Prize finalist for a series of editorials on gun control and the Texas gun culture. He's the author of 6 books, including Hometown Texas, a collection of his weekly native Texan columns, Hurricane Season, the unforgettable story of the Houston Astros and the resilience of a city, and Sutherland Springs, God, Guns, and a Small Texas Town, which was published in 2020 and recipient of the 2021 Carr P. Collins Award, presented by the Texas Institute of Letters in recognition of the year's best work of nonfiction. The book explores the aftermath of the mass shooting at the Baptist Church.
Figure out why it's not working.
In 2017. Joe and his wife, Laura Tolley, and yes, it's Holley and not Holley, a former journalist herself with the Associated Press, divide their time between Austin and Marathon, Texas. So Joe, I will kick it over to you.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Angela. And thank you also, friends of the foundation, for joining us today. I was just thinking when Katie said that about Laura, you realize why Laura and I don't hyphenate our names. But and thank you, Glenn, my old friend Glenn, for introducing us to Katie years ago, and also to other friends whose either faces or names I see here this evening. I'm speaking to you from Austin, where we live. I'm looking out the window. It's a beautiful evening, and I'm glad we're here together. Maybe the next time we get together, it'll be face to face. That's all hope. You know, I should say at the outset that I'm not a historian, nor do I play one on TV, despite the medium that we're using tonight. I'm a journalist whose self-selected beat is history, and whose lifelong avocation is history. And I mean that literally. And I got interested, I think, in history from my dad when I was 4 or 5 years old, and I was helping him on his potato chip route, and we would go to small towns around Waco. And I began to realize that these towns had stories and personalities of their own, and they intrigued me. I should also say that some of my best friends are historians. I think of Bob Abzug and Bill Brands and Michael Hall at UT, Jerry Thompson at Texas A&M International. I mean, these are people you all know. Jim Crisp, who used to be at North Carolina State and knows everything about Texas history, it seems to me. Caleb McDaniel at Rice, the Pulitzer Prize winner. Barry Hankins at Baylor, Ron Tyler, who used to be at Amon Carter. And then other Texans or other historians, including Texans, whom I admire and on whom I rely, even though I haven't met them. And I'm thinking of Annette Gordon Reed, a Texan at Harvard, whose book Juneteenth is just superb. I'm thinking of Monica Munoz Martinez at Brown, who has written extensively about the Porvenir massacre, and also Jill Lepore from Harvard, on whom I rely. And then as I was thinking of those names, I thought also of site managers around the state, people like Brian McCauley at San Felipe de Austin and Cynthia Evans at the French legation. Almost anywhere you go in the state, their counterparts are keeping history alive and discovering new facts, people, and information that are worth knowing about. I also just remembered how often I visit with directors of small town museums in places like McCamey, Bigfoot, where my mother grew up, Paradise. Yes, there is a paradise in Texas. These people are perennially short of funds, and their institutions may look like their grandmother's attic, ATTIC, but there are always things worth finding out about. And they feel a deep respect and a veneration for their community and for the institutions they serve. Now, despite my connections with historians around the state, none could have come to my aid a few weeks ago when I found myself scaling a fence around a cemetery in Houston, Houston's oldest cemetery, in fact, Glendale Cemetery, not Glenwood. That's the one that most people know. This is Glendale Cemetery. It's on the east side. It butts up against the ship channel. So once you get over the fence into Glendale Cemetery, you're likely to see a barge passing by within 100 yards of you. So here I am on this, the iron bars of this fence, sort of straddling it. And as I'm trying to get over, I try to think, which would be the worst Houston Chronicle headline? Elderly journalist arrested for trespassing in a historic Houston cemetery, or elderly Houston journalist impaled on iron bars of a historic Houston cemetery. Fortunately, neither of those came to pass. And I got into the cemetery and was wandering around. And I was there because a reader of the column had asked a question and I didn't know the answer. And that happens frequently. Readers will ask me something I don't know. Fortunately, I have the time and the opportunity to find out. The question in this case was, we live in Harris County. Who's Harris? I didn't know. I discovered that John Richard Harris's tombstone is in that cemetery, even though the man himself is buried in New Orleans. John Richard Harris lived an amazing life. And most of us, myself included, know nothing about it. We know the Allen brothers, we know Sam Houston, but we don't know John Richard Harris. So this fellow was born in upstate New York. He married a woman named Jane Birdsall, and the couple migrated to Missouri. And there they met a man named Moses Austin. And Austin persuaded them to move to Texas, to his colony in Texas. Of course, Moses Austin died shortly thereafter, but they did. They moved to Texas. In fact, Harris sailed his own sloop down the Mississippi to New Orleans and then over to Galveston, and found himself something like 4,400 acres on Buffalo Bayou. He also laid out a town, and he named it, of course, Harrisburg. He built general store. Other people came in, settled in what was Harrisburg. He built the first steam-powered sawmill in Texas. He and his brothers captained a fleet of ships, schooners, that plied the Gulf from Tampico in Mexico to Harrisburg, Galveston, and then over to New Orleans. He donated 2 of those schooners for use in the Texas Revolution. And we don't know it. We don't know much about him. And we don't know him partly because he died a few years before the Texas Revolution. There's a wonderful amateur historian and writer in Houston named Dan Worrell, who's written about early Houston. And I asked him, why don't we know Harris? And he said, well, he died too soon. He missed his time in the spotlight, even though the town he laid out was much better. It was a much better site for a city than the one the Allen brothers founded more than a decade later. So that's John Richard Harris. And people, there are individuals like that all over this state, not only in the big cities like Houston, but in small towns, the towns themselves we may not have ever heard of. So after that column came out, a reader gently reminded me that just a few weeks before I had scaled the fence at the cemetery in Houston, I was slithering under a barbed wire fence out close to Marathon, onto the property of a ranch owned by the Combs family. You know, Susan Combs, who used to be agriculture secretary here in Texas. There I was hoping that one of her people didn't show up with a shotgun and ask, "What are you doing?" And nobody did. But the reason I was slithering under the fence, I couldn't find a gate, is because there's a tombstone high up on a hill near Marathon. And that tombstone is the grave of a fellow named Bloss Payne, B-L-A-S, Bloss Payne. And Bloss Payne was a remarkable cowboy who is also, or was also, a Black Seminole. Payne and his relations, and they're still out in the Big Bend, still in the Marathon area and around Brackettville, were Black Seminoles. Their 18th century ancestors were African Americans who fled plantations in South Carolina and they found refuge among the Seminole in the Florida Everglades. And the Seminoles, as you probably know, had been there for a long, long time in Spanish Florida and lived pretty much undisturbed. All of that changed, of course, when the U.S. acquired Florida. They were the Seminoles, including their Black Seminole relatives by then, were forced to resettle in Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. And in the 1840s, the Black Seminoles were concerned about being captured by slave traders who had infiltrated Indian Territory. And so many of them made their way down through Texas and across the Rio Grande into Mexico, where they lived and established small towns just across the river. This country, after the Civil War, enticed them back because they were superb trackers, soldiers, and the U.S. Army needed them in their battles against the Apaches and the Comanches. So they came back and they settled out in the Big Bend. They were promised land at Fort Clark, which is Brackettville. We reneged on the promise, but they stayed around and they became superb cowboys. And that's what Bloss Payne was. So imagine this, it's the spring of 1916 and Bloss is 15 years old and he's down on the Rio Grande cowboying and he hears that Pancho Villa's men are crossing the river. Whether Villa himself was with this group of Mexican revolutionaries, I don't know. But there was a 3-day battle down on the Rio Grande, and 4 Americans were killed. The revolutionaries took the payroll of a Boquillas silver mine, and so it was a big deal. Young Bloss was worried that the revolutionaries were going to make their way up toward Marathon. So late at night, he somehow rounded up something like 200 horses. And at nighttime, through that rough country, drove those horses into Marathon to keep them safe and to warn the townspeople that something was going on. That was Bloss Payne. He died in 1990. And it's hard to realize that someone who had that experience was among us until just a few years ago. Again, there are people like Bloss Payne all over the state. Texans we ought to know, but don't. I discovered another one of those Texans we ought to know, but don't, when a reader reminded me that very few Texas towns are named after women. Stop and think about it. You may have heard the story about how Sam Houston was talking one evening to Charlotte Allen, who was married to one of the Allen brothers. And Houston mentioned to her in his sort of probably overly polite way, you know, this town shouldn't be named Houston. It ought to be called Charlottesville because you have done so much for this community. Charlotte Allen, you know, she said, well, no, Houston is the name that people will remember. So we don't have a Charlottesville. But when you stop and think about it, what are the towns named after Texas women? The ones that do exist are most likely named for railroad people. They named, as they were pushing the railroad through the state, they'd named little settlements or watering sites for their daughters or their wives or their mothers. Maybe the biggest one that I can find, I could be mistaken, but I think the largest one named after a woman in Texas is Hallettsville. Think about it. See if there's any more. I can't. Most of them are small towns, like the little town of Charlotte, like Edna, like Louise. They're around the state, but Hallettsville may be large. It's less than 2,000 people. So Hallettsville is the little Lavaca County seat between Houston and San Antonio. It's named after Margaret Hallett. Now, Margaret Hallett was born in Virginia in 1787. When she was 18, she fell in love with a British merchant seaman. Her parents thought she could do better than a merchant seaman, but they married anyway. And he continued, by then he had become an American citizen, and he continued being a sailor. And he fought in the War of 1812 against his former countrymen. And then after the war, he had several ships that he sailed out of Baltimore and New York. He was sailing down around Key West, and he was involved in a shipwreck. And with the insurance money from that shipwreck, he and his wife, Margaret, bought a general store / trading post at Matamoros. And so they moved to Mexico. They both knew Spanish, and yet at some point they got kicked out of Mexico by the Mexican government, and they settled on land they had acquired in Austin's colony on the Lavaca River. Now, Margaret's husband died, and so she and her teenage daughter, opened a general store in their cabin there on their land on the Lavaca River. She learned not only to get along with, but to trade with the Indians in the area. She raised horses, and she donated 500 acres to her neighbors as the site for a town. And in her honor, they named it Hallettsville. So Margaret Hallett died in 1863 at age 76. The residents of Hallettsville today probably know Margaret Hallett, but not many others do. Again, there are men and women like her all over the state. Now, sometimes newcomers to Texas don't stay around all that long, although their stories are probably worth remembering anyway. Now, I'm thinking of the little town of Aurora. I mentioned the town of Paradise. Aurora is just east of Paradise, northwest of Fort Worth, something strange happened in Aurora in 1896, according to the Dallas Morning News. I work for the Houston Chronicle, but I have to believe the Dallas Morning News, right? Something strange happened early one morning, 6 o'clock or so. An unidentified flying object hit a windmill just outside Aurora, caught fire, the windmill caught fire, and whatever the unidentified flying object was, it fell to the ground through the windmill. Residents went over there as the sun is coming up, and they find, remember, we're relying on the Dallas Morning News, they find a pilot. They decide first of all that mysterious, almost hieroglyphic style markings on the wreckage suggest to them that it is of Martian origin. Okay. They also decide to give the pilot, little guy, to give the pilot a Christian burial, which they give him a funeral, they bury him in the town cemetery. And they decide to take the wreckage, complete with hieroglyphics, and throw it down a well. And so when townspeople come asking, when they've read the Dallas Morning News, they make the trek past Fort Worth out to Aurora and ask to see the unidentified flying object and pilot. Well, the townspeople say, sorry, we don't have it anymore. So a few years ago, I drove up to Aurora and was asking around. I found the city manager who had a little blow up ET sitting in her office, ET extraterrestrial. And she directed me to a man, a local resident who had written a book about this strange and interesting incident in 1896, 1897, 6 years before the Wright brothers. And so I went looking for him. I couldn't find his house. So I went to a convenience store first and asked for him. And then they directed me to where he lived. He lived in a house behind the Tater Junction restaurant. I drove through Aurora not long ago, and it looked like the Tater Junction restaurant had succumbed to the pandemic, unfortunately. But anyway, I found him. But just before I drove over to his house, a man who had been in the convenience store and had overheard who I was asking for and what I was asking about came out to my car. And he said, I want to tell you a story. He wouldn't tell me his name, but he said that he was a retired Fort Worth police officer and that he was frequently on the night shift. And one night, driving home from Fort Worth to Aurora, he was driving by a stock tank near the highway, near the road. And he noticed above that tank this machine, for lack of a better word, or flying object or vehicle or something hovering over the tank. And the machine looked like a child's top. You remember a top that you there's a pump and you pump it and it spins, not the one that's small and that you use a little string to make it spin. This is like a big thing. And this big thing is over the tank and it's drawing water up into the bottom part inside. And he stood there, or he sat in his car and watched it for a while. And then there were lights. There were lights on this top that were twinkling, different colored lights. And then it flew away. It went away up into the sky, never to be seen again. So he got home and woke his wife up, and he said, let me tell you what I saw a few minutes ago. And so she listened patiently, and she said, maybe you shouldn't tell that story to anybody else. He told me, but whether he's been telling it for all these years, I don't know. but that's what you find in Texas, stories that you find in Texas. I almost always have to tell the story of visitors to Texas, not only who didn't stick around like the visitors to Aurora, but who sort of left their mark without really meaning to. And I think of Nacogdoches, one of my favorite towns in Texas, a beautiful place. I like the people, and I like the stories that I found in Nacogdoches. I think I've written 3 or 4 columns about this East Texas town. One of my favorites is 1907. Nacogdoches at the time, and still does, has an opera house downtown. And Nacogdoches, being the cultured, sophisticated community that it was and is, was on the vaudeville circuit. You know, speakers and musical groups, opera, various things would come through. On this Saturday in 1907 that I'm thinking about, a group calling themselves the Four Nightingales were in town. They're from Brooklyn, and they're 4 young men dressed in sort of sailor suits. They have this sort of paper rose on the lapels. They're wearing straw sort of sailor hats. And they play the mandolin, they play the guitar, they sing little songs, they dance, they tell little stories. And they're regulars on the vaudeville circuit. They ride the train from Brooklyn down the East Coast, probably to New Orleans, over to Texas, you know, Nacogdoches, probably Dallas, Houston, maybe. Their manager is their mother. Her name is Minnie. 3 of these young men are her sons. One is a friend of the 3 boys. And she's a real tough manager, not only for the boys, but she's a penny pincher. She has to save money. And so even though the boys are close to 20 years old, they're still traveling half fare on the train. And one day, one of the conductors came over to Minnie, and he said, you know, that kid of yours is in the dining car smoking a cigar, and there's another one in the washroom shaving. Minnie sighed. She looked at the conductor and she said, they grow up so fast. Anyway, here are the 4 Nightingales in Nacogdoches performing on stage. And it's not going particularly well, but it's a full house. So that Minnie's happy about that. But in the middle of their performance, the doors, you know, at the back of the auditorium burst open, and a fellow shouts, "A mule is loose." The whole audience gets up out of their seats, heads toward the exits, and they're gone. And as it turned out, a mule on Main Street was loose. It had gotten loose from a wagon, or maybe it was still connected to the wagon, but it was running wild up and down the street. And audience members, even those in the balcony, were out on the street watching the mule until it was finally captured. And then they began to stream back in. The 4 Nightingales, particularly one of them, were enraged. They were upset that their act was so disrespected. One of them in particular, one of the 4 Nightingales in particular, was upset. And he was sort of pacing back and forth on stage, insulting his audience. In Texas, his brothers kept trying to remind him. He'd say stuff like, "Nacogdoches is full of roaches," partly because he couldn't think of any other word that rhymed with Nacogdoches. And suddenly, he and his 2 brothers and their friend realized that the audience was in stitches. They were rolling in the aisles. They were laughing. They were so happy to be there. And that's when, at that very moment, in Nacogdoches, in 1907, the 4 Nightingales, actually the Marx brothers, Groucho, Gummo, and Harpo realized they were comedians, not musicians. I sure hope that story is true. There's a historical marker on the Opera House wall that tells that story. And it's a good story, I think. You know, now and then, I get emails from readers who urge me to avoid the political, and you know, that they'll say things like that the native Texan column is the only reason I continue subscribing to the Houston Chronicle, because of those socialistic editorials that you all run, those communist editorials. I'm tempted sometimes to remind them that the author of Native Texan also writes those editorials, even now, even though I'm retired, I still write them. Usually I resist the temptation and say, okay, I'll try not to veer into the political. But for the moment, tonight, this evening, I hope you'll indulge my political inclinations, for lack of a better word. It seems to me, particularly as the legislature runs down in next week, that misguided lawmakers who want to whitewash Texas history, and I mean that word literally, have to be resisted. Because there are at least, however well-intentioned they are, you know as well or better than I do that there are at least a couple of things wrong with that effort. One is the history of this state is so much richer, so much more colorful, so much more interesting than the official version that many of us grew up with, that we have to be able to tell those stories. A second reason that comes to mind is that when you think about it, when we venerate the icons, the men, and I mean that literally as well, the men whose names grace our streets and our counties and our cities, it's hard to identify with a statue. It's hard to feel any connection with a statue. And that's what I think makes history so valuable, particularly for our young people. They need to identify with early Texans who came and built this place, whether they're known or not. I know it's easy for me to say, since a local school district or a small town museum or a library district doesn't pay my salary. But I would urge my fellow explorers of the Texas past to scale the fences, to slither underneath the barbed wire, and to remind our short-sighted lawmakers that the Texas story in all its fullness needs to be told. It's too interesting, it's too valuable to be missed. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was really fun and interesting. And there's been a lot of chat going back and forth, and people are throwing out names of towns named after women. There was one gentleman, Kirk, asked about the author that the amateur historian that in Houston that you talked about, Dan Worrell, right? That's the name?
That's right, Worrall.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Mm.
Somebody asked about, and I found the article that you wrote about the Marx brothers that I've shared in the chat as well. So, folks, please do read that. Somebody asked, Nancy Birch says, mention Pudge Heffelfinger.
Here's another name. Raise your hand if anybody knows Pudge Heffelfinger. Glenn, do you know him?
No, I'm afraid I don't, although I do know a Heffelfinger, but her name is not Pudge.
Pudge Heffelfinger is the first professional football player. Not the first professional football player in Texas, the first professional football player. I'd never heard of the fellow either until I was wandering around a cemetery near Blessing, Texas, where Shanghai Pierce is buried, the rancher. And he's buried with a 40-foot high statue that he commissioned before he died. But, standing there looking up at Shanghai Pierce's statue, and I turned around, there behind me was the gravesite of Pudge Heffelfinger. He was a Yale football player in the 1880s. And when he graduated, I think he probably played 5 years or so. Nobody was checking eligibility back then. He was a pulling guard. He was an amazing athlete. And when he finished playing, some company in Cleveland, I think, I hope maybe somebody has the article up, but some company hired him to play on its football team, and they paid him. And he was the first to be paid to play football. And of course, then the NFL develops, and Heffelfinger stayed around professional football his whole life. But he also married a woman from Texas who had ranching connections in South Texas around Blessing. And so that's where he's buried. Remember, there's a great football card of Pudge Heffelfinger if you can put your hands on it. So thanks for that question. Pudge will appreciate it.
Thank you for sharing that. Elizabeth asks, is Angelina the only county named for a woman?
I don't know. That's the only one that comes to mind. Anybody else know of one? And who do we know who Angelina was?
Elizabeth, you asked that question. Do you know who Elizabeth was that the county was named for? If you do, please drop that in the chat box. We'd love to know. Angela Fondren says she had a Texas history book that was written in story format, and the story she most remembers is about Ma Ferguson and her government tenure.
Angela, I lost a little bit of what you said.
So Angela Fondren is talking about a story about Ma Ferguson and her government tenure.
Right.
Is that a story you know and can share more about?
Only that there are a lot of stories about Ma Ferguson, who was a stand-in for Pa, and there are stories probably not true about things like if English was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me, things of that sort. Her pardoning of prisoners, her firing of the Texas Rangers and establishing a police force of her own. She's a strong-willed woman. Whether she was a fine governor is certainly debatable.
Thank you. Bernice Mistrot actually found some information about Angelina County. It's named named for a Hassanai Native American woman who assisted early Spanish missionaries and was named Angelina by them.
Good. Yeah. Good, thanks.
Joe, do you know the story behind the town of Dime Box? Why is that town named that? I've always been curious about that.
I'm tempted to say I do, but I don't know the details. I know I don't. I should say I don't.
Okay.
Does anybody know
something? Yeah, that would be. Does anyone know about Dime Box? Why was it named that?
I wouldn't be surprised if it's a story similar to the name of the town where my mother grew up, Bigfoot. not the creature, not Sasquatch, but it's named after Bigfoot Wallace. It's south. Bigfoot is south of San Antonio, about 40 miles. Excuse me, y'all. And it's named Bigfoot because Bigfoot Wallace spent his last years in the little community, and there was a general store in Bigfoot, and Bigfoot Wallace would frequently send a little boy to the store to buy his tobacco for him, but he wouldn't pay. You see, I'll pay you Tuesday for my tobacco today or whatever. And so the storekeeper had a blackboard behind the counter where he would put names of those customers who owed him. And Bigfoot's name was on that blackboard so frequently and so regularly that the people started calling their town Bigfoot, and it still is. So maybe, you know, dime box may be something like that, but I'm not sure.
Right. Jean Crane from the Texas Historical Foundation asks, how did you learn about Blas Payne? She says she used to live in Marathon, and she's curious about how you find these stories.
You know, I find stories either by people emailing me or just people I run into, or I go write a story and find out something else after I'm there. Laura and I have a little house out in Marathon, and, you know, just by talking to people about characters actually who either still live there or live around Marathon and Alpine and Marfa and Fort Davis and Terlingua. In fact, in the 5 years or so that we've had our house out there, I've learned so many interesting Big Bend stories that I could almost be the Big Bend Texan. You know, every week could be something about Blas Payne or some other Big Bend character. So I'm sure I learned about Blas Payne just by talking to people. There's also a really good book called Black Cowboys of Texas, and Blas Payne is part of that collection.
Thank you for sharing that. And thank you, Bernice, for sharing the information about Dime Box. I would not have looked for that, so thank you. Kirk Eason says he's very familiar with Bigfoot and the tree in the middle of the road.
Yeah, he's exactly right. And I worry that somehow that old tree, you know, a winter storm is going to get it, or something's going to happen to it. But it's been there as long as I've been going to Bigfoot, and that's since I was an infant. Living in Waco and going to see our grandmother, my brothers and I, you know, driving from Waco to San Antonio and then to Bigfoot, my brothers and I would always know that we were there when we could see the tree in the middle of the road. And I'm surprised also that people haven't run into it, but as far as I know, they haven't.
Joe, you mentioned two of our historic sites, the San Felipe de Austin, site managers, Brian McCauley out at San Felipe de Austin in Sealy, or near Sealy, and then Cynthia Evans. And I know you've written about the French legation. Could you share some stories about the legation and about San Felipe?
I love the French legation, partly because it's in the middle of Austin. It's right where you are bound to get stuck in traffic at I-35. Instead of looking to the left at the police station in downtown Austin, look to the right. You can't see it, it's up a hill. But there's this wonderful house, the French legation, and you all are restoring it. And is it open officially yet?
It is open officially, yes.
And there are wonderful stories about that house, about the French ambassador, about the pig war. You know, pigs got loose in Austin and invaded his house and jumped into his bed and soiled his French linens, and initiated the pig war. The other interesting thing that Cynthia was telling me is that it was the center of a multicultural Austin neighborhood. There were Swedes, African Americans, Mexican Americans, all living right around the French legation. And signs of that multicultural neighborhood are still there in street names and historic houses and so forth. But it's a fascinating part of Austin that even Austinites don't know that much about.
Absolutely. We're really excited. The site opened in February. It's open for visitors right now. I think you still have to call and make an appointment, but
Yeah.
The exhibits are up and everything is available for people to view and learn about.
It's a beautiful old house, and it's also a wonderful site now that we get back to sort of semi-normal life for weddings and receptions. The grounds are just stunning up on a hill that people don't see.
Absolutely.
And then you ask about San Felipe de Austin. That's a beautiful museum, a brand new, relatively new museum, and the exhibits about that terribly important community in Texas history are really engaging. And I haven't been there in a year or so, but I understand that they had a fire. That Angela, you might tell something.
Yes, unfortunately, we are actually in the middle of building an exhibit, an outdoor exhibit, which is basically a representation of the town of San Felipe as it was back in just before the revolution, before the runaway scrape. And this exhibit includes about 12 different buildings, full-size buildings, representing the courthouse at that time, the Farmers Hotel, the print shop, Borden's print shop. This is Borden of the Borden milk fame, and Celia's clay oven. In fact, we had one of our virtual events a couple of last month was from San Felipe, from Celia's bake oven. Celia Allen was a freed woman who assisted in baking for the Farmers Hotel. So there's a story about her. There's a courthouse building structure that was part of this exhibit that burnt in a fire on April 9th. So unfortunately, we are working on sort of having that rebuilt. But we hope to have it all done by the end of summer or early fall, and then the exhibit will be open to the public, and it's an incredible place to go visit.
Yeah.
So definitely plan a trip.
It's ironic because it's a fire is unfortunate anywhere, but it's probably historically accurate. Those old wooden buildings probably burned.
Yeah, absolutely. Rowena, you are on. Rowena Dash is one of our board members, and I know she was very keen on this particular event because Rowena has family history in Texas as well. Rowena, do you have any questions? I know you were sharing some books and stuff in the chat, which I'm sure people have looked at, but any thoughts, questions that you might want to share?
Well, Jane Birdsell Harris was my great grandmother. And my favorite family story is just the image of her standing at her home, watching the Texas government escape into Galveston Bay in a little boat ahead of the Mexican army, which then proceeded to burn down her home.
That's exactly right, yeah.
And after the Battle of San Jacinto, she rebuilt it. She stayed, despite the fact that her husband was gone and had died. And she stayed there and ran a boarding house for many more years. And then I guess he would have been her great-great-grandson, Birdsell Briscoe. His final architectural project in Houston, and he and John Staub essentially laid out River Oaks, as well as other parts of Houston. Yeah. His final project was to build for my grandmother a sort of a replica of that home in River Oaks, which was my family home. And just recently, we have passed it on to a new set of owners after 60 years. So, but anyway, that home is a protected historic landmark now. We'll be in Houston for many years to come. The home in Harrisburg is of course gone, but that home was actually based on a home in New York State, from near where the Birdsell family lived. So anyway, it's wonderful I never thought that people didn't know who John and Jane Birdsell Harris were.
Yeah.
I certainly have always known who they were, but appreciate, and I've been to, I remember being as a child going, there was a big event in 1986 around the sesquicentennial at Glendale to kind of clean up the headstones and put in some markers and things like that. And I remember being out there for that.
Rowena, was that house out there still standing until fairly recently?
I don't think so. I think, in fact, my memory is that it burned. And the family moved into Houston, which is where most of the family is buried at Glenwood. And of course, Adele Briscoe-Luskin is also part of this whole family line, and she helped found the Texas State Historical Association and was a historian herself.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So, and she's so anyway, the family kind of migrated away from Harrisburg still during the 19th century. The home in Houston was on Austin Street initially.
Okay. Your story reminds me that just yesterday I discovered, other people know that, but I discovered another historic cemetery I'd never heard of in Houston called Olivewood Cemetery. It's an African-American cemetery sort of between downtown Houston and the Heights.
So near Glenwood.
Well, yeah, sort of. It's that area of Houston where Target and H-E-B have moved in the last 10 years or so. And it was just totally forgotten, covered over by just a thicket, trees and bushes. And it's an African-American cemetery, and some of the descendants vaguely realized that they had relatives in that cemetery, but they didn't know where it was because you couldn't see it. And over the last 25 or 30 years, they've been cleaning it out, and it's a beautiful place. And, not enough Houstonians know about it.
Mike Vance just said that the cemetery that you're talking about is very near Glenwood, north of Washington Avenue on the west side of Studemont.
That's exactly right. Have you seen it, Mike?
Let me unmute. Yeah, I did some work out there. It was the oldest known African-American cemetery in Houston. Officially, it dates to about 1870.
That's right.
But there are probably some older graves there. There were a lot of enslaved cemeteries that are not marked. One of them in Houston, just as an aside, I'm pretty sure is underneath Wharton Elementary School.
Oh, really? Yeah.
But Olivewood is an amazing place. It was a Methodist cemetery. It's where Jack Yates initially was.
Yeah. But
when they built College Memorial Park, which is a Baptist cemetery, Jack Yates being Baptist, they moved him from the Methodists to the Baptists.
And as Yates is a good example, but the people who were buried there were early entrepreneurs, ministers, educators, important people in the African-American community. And
absolutely, a lot of business owners. Yeah. And a lot of the grave markers are pretty impressive. They spent a great deal of money on those monuments.
Yeah, exactly. It's also in danger because the bayou is slowly taking it over, coming, and anytime it floods. Yesterday, for example, there are pools of water all through that cemetery, and they need money to sort of shore it up.
Yeah, it's run by descendants.
Right.
And they have a nonprofit group, but not big pocketbooks.
Right,
so
exactly.
To help.
Our board member, Laretha Clay, is asking if you have heard of, Joe, either you or Mike, if you have heard of the cemetery in the Freedom Colony of Tamina near the Woodlands that is underwater right now?
Underwater just because of the recent rains?
Well, I think it's just underwater, period, is what I understand. Laretha, can you unmute and share some more about that?
No, I don't know, but I'd like to know.
Yeah, I think it's Tamina. It's like a Tamina Road. If you're on 45 going toward Dallas, off near the Woodlands. And I was talking to a descendant the other day, and they were telling us about how that cemetery is flooded and the work they're trying to do to keep it to get the water out of it. But it's been flooded for a while. So it just made me, when you were talking about this other cemetery, it made me think of that one.
Yeah, no, I've never heard of it, but is it the city, is it the Woodlands that's trying to protect it?
No, the Woodlands is the problem. or the expansion of the Woodlands is what is threatening this community. Even though it's like the Woodlands is more of like, if you're going north on 45, the Woodlands is more, I don't know, north, south, east, west, but if you're going north on 45, the Woodlands is more to the left-hand side, and Tamina is more to the right. So Tamina is across on the right side, but it's still being threatened because of all the growth around there with the Woodlands.
Yeah, and tell me again what it's called, Aretha.
I think it's called Tamina, Tamina, and when you're on 45, you'll see Tamina Road.
Okay.
Like right after you pass the whatever the exit is for that toll road that takes you right into downtown, that lets you bypass, is right after you exit there. Then you'll another couple exits up, you'll see Tamina Road or whatever it's called, Tamina or whatever. Yeah.
Got you. Thanks.
One of those communities, African-American communities, and there's several that were around Houston that remained without any sort of utility services for decades after there was wealth going on right next door.
Yeah, right.
Riceville out in Southwest Houston was another one. Bordersville and Aldine was another one. Tamina's in Montgomery County, but it was neglected. They had nothing, even while the Woodlands is going up just across the freeway.
And it's similar, Mike, with Olivewood. It was surrounded by industry and now by condos and townhouses, but it is protected from development overrunning it, but it's nature now that's the problem.
I did want to share, and Dr. McKnight, I just wanted to just send a shout out to you. Thank you so much for joining us. And I wanted to share that Texas Historical Commission does have a relatively new program focused on identifying and recording lost cemeteries across Texas. And they are working on this project going all the way back to the late 1800s and identifying cemeteries that were in some sort of public record at that time, but then over a period of time got lost. And so they're going back and trying to figure out where those cemeteries are and recording them actually, physically as part of the data that THC collects and gathers about cemeteries. So,
and I have Olivewood on the mind at the moment, but they also have students from Lone Star College, Cyprus, working with them, trying to identify grave sites and so forth.
Yes. Yep. And we have an intern coming up over the summer who will also be working on this project.
Good.
As part of our Preservation Scholars Program. We are past 7 o'clock. It's 7:03. Joe, I know you said you are happy to hang a little more time, a few more minutes if people want to continue talking. But to everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a fun one, and I'm going to do my research and find some more fun stories and look for your articles, Joe. To read. Thank you again, Joe, for being with us today. And we'll stay on for just a little more time if anyone has any final questions. Otherwise, please, thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening and a great long weekend.
Angeli, this is Kathy McKnight, and I want to thank you for this program. Hey, it was really great. Joe, it was fun to hear everything. And I'm actually heading out to Fort Davis tomorrow.
Oh, good.
So love that part of the world, but it was a really great program. So thank you so much.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Commissioner McKnight. Bernice just says, family lore says her father-in-law laid out the town of Dime Box while working for the, is that SPCA or circa 1912? Working for the SP, circa 1912. I need to do more research on Dime Box, Texas.
Yeah. I think I do too, because everybody seems to be interested in Dime Box.
Well, I just remember the town because I used to in a past job I used to drive down towards College Station a lot, and you pass Dime Box, Texas, and I've passed it hundreds of times, literally, and always wondered how it got its name.
There's also old dime box and new dime box.
Yep. And I think Bernice or somebody did put something in the chat from Wikipedia. Bernice did. The origin of the name dime box stemmed from a custom in which early settlers would use a large wooden box to forward and receive mail or order small items from a carrier on horseback traveling to nearby Giddings. So I'm guessing that they would put dimes in there to sort of as payment or something. I don't know.
I'm going to go over and find out. I've been inspired.
Well, thank you all for joining us. We appreciate it. And please do register for the next event. That's going to be a fun one as well.
Great.
Katie, any last words?
No, except this is probably every writer's least favorite question, but for those of us that spend a lot of time stuck in traffic and driving, any chance you'll ever turn these stories into a podcast?
I think I'm a technical Luddite, and I've thought about combining with my son, Pete, who's a Texas Monthly senior editor, and maybe doing a multi-generational pod site. In fact, I had a story idea for him last night, and I called him all excited, and he said, "Dad, that's a great story. It's just 5 years too late." So,
Joe, we might have just the project for you and your son.
All right.
We are working on, we hope to be able to get funding for a Texas history app. And part of that is a potential podcast that we want to include. So,
Yeah, call me.
If you don't mind, we'll reach out to you with some ideas and see if that interests you.
I'd love to. And also, I meant to mention a while ago, if people want to email me with ideas, questions, whatever, make it available, Katie or Anjali. And
Katie, would you mind dropping that in the chat, please?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll do it right now.
Good. Thank you all again very much.
Thank you. Katie, go ahead and drop that in the chat, and then I'll end it so people will have that in the recording.
Yeah, I'm doing right now. Give me 1 second to copy it over. Let's see. There we go. I think I got it.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you all. We're going to end this now. And thank you, Joe, very much for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.